Thank you very much. So again, I'm Nicholas Economou. I'm the CEO of H5, and I'm with the Future Society as well. I have with me Julie Brickell, who is our general counsel. I'm going to take a few minutes to show you a little show and tell. It relates to the discussion about the FDA for algorithms earlier. And it's I'll show you the results of some studies that were conducted by NIST, the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a non-regulatory measurement body, right? So their expertise is measuring stuff, how well it works. And at the dawn, one could say, of the age of electronic discovery, NIST decided to conduct a series of studies to assess how well AI-assisted processes could actually do at automating the somewhat complex assessments that usually attorneys make in document review. And so they did what you'd expect they'd do. They found a data set of 30 million or so pages or documents. One of them in one of the years was actually the Enron data that we spoke about today. They had an attorney who was playing the role of the actual lawyer. They invited one and all companies like ours, law firms and others, to participate, academic institutions. The lawyer defined certain responsive topics, so topics for which we would be tasked to go and find the actual relevant documents. And then all participants, using their AI technologies, machine learning typically, but not only, conducted a full review. You had a few weeks, it wasn't a lot of time, and you had to give back your results. And then NIST had designed a statistical protocol to measure the accuracy, right? How well did these AI systems actually do at replicating and automating the judgments of attorneys in making responsiveness assessments. And I will show you these results because I think they might be a little unexpected, and they raise interesting questions about some of the things we're talking about today. And they also show you how science, when confronted to the realities on the ground, sometimes produces some odd outcomes. So I won't explain that chart in any detail at all, but it actually plots all of the results of participants in a couple of years. These were 2008, 2009. There were some studies after that, but nothing material changed compared to that. I should say, by the way, that this is a bit of it's sort of edited to fit the format of this presentation. I would not publish this chart in an academic journal because it amalgamates a number of studies and data points, but the substance of it is correct. So just to situate you on this chart that you see, perfection is the upper right corner. If you were exactly on the upper right corner, it would mean that you had 0 false positives, 0 false negatives. Your result set was perfect, right? Which means you found exactly what the lead attorney who was in charge of the review would have found if she or he had had all the time in the world to assess every single document collection. It's a perfect replication and automation of a human judgment. At the other end of that chart on the lower left, you're at the opposite end of that, which means you didn't find a single good document, and everything you said was actually relevant was not, right? So you had only false positives, only false negatives. So you want to be as far up the right-hand corner as you want. So I'm showing that to say a couple of things. One is you can see that the results are all over the place, which in and of itself is not super comforting. The light gray box, if it shows, it's a bit maybe too light, but the light gray box shows you the 50% mark. So anything above that is actually our approaches and systems that have achieved 50% or higher accuracy. And you can see that there are just in total 3 dots that have made it there. Now, this excludes academic institutions. This is really the companies and law firms who participated. One academic institution, the University of Waterloo, was up in the upper right corner as well. But effectively, you can see that the vast majority of approaches achieve less than 50% accuracy, which means that I'll let you think about how the truth-seeking function of the law is supported by a fact-finding function that cannot achieve more than 50% accuracy. The smaller gray box, slightly darker gray box, shows you the 75% accuracy threshold. And there you can just see a couple of dots. And so it tells you that AI actually can successfully replicate and automate human judgments that are quite complex in discovery, But it turns out it's not that easy, right? And that was, again, 2008, 2009. The subsequent studies that were conducted didn't show anything much different that NIST conducted. These studies ended, unfortunately, 2011. But I'm not aware of any scholarship since that shows anything different than that. So that's one thing I want to show. I know I have little time, and Peter, you want to make some comments as well. But this is really a word of caution in a world where we see a lot of bombardment of claims and hype around AI of what the science actually shows. And the interesting thing is that there was a meta-study of these studies done that was a very good meta-study that effectively said, yes, AI actually can do as well or better than humans. And the meta-study showed that a couple of approaches demonstrated better than human performance. The little green dot that you see was actually the control human team, which didn't do that great either. But in the general legal space, that meta-study that said that AI can possibly, in effect, do better than humans was misunderstood generally to mean, oh, AI does better than humans, and AI works. So the science is there, and it's very poorly understood. So the second thing I want to show you, which I think is a great finding as well, what this plots is in the last year of the study, 2011, NIST asked the participants to not only give the results, but to also share with NIST their own assessment of their own accuracy, right? Which NIST after that was going to measure. And what this shows you is the difference between the accuracy entrants thought they had achieved and the accuracy they actually had achieved. So you pick any light blue point on the top of the dark point, and then you follow the red line, and it tells you for that entrant what the difference was. And as you can see, there as well, there is a great difference between the accuracy people thought they had achieved, entrants, and that which they had achieved. And so the mean difference between the accuracy participants, and these are law firms using AI, vendors of AI technologies, I mean, these are people who are active in the industry, the mean difference was 34%, right? So what that means is that when somebody walks into court and makes the representation that their AI system, the review system achieved 50% accuracy, the underlying number, this suggests, could be as low as 16% or as high as 84%. So that means you might just as well take a dart and throw it at the wall. And then the question might be, well, why? After all, it shouldn't be that difficult to measure accuracy. And yet this is the reality on the ground. And everywhere across the country today, you have big data document review being done in important matters where the facts truly matter to the adjudication of justice and of the cases, and where parties will make representations as to the accuracy they have achieved, and where in effect we as a society today, those studies suggest, can absolutely not trust the ways in which the accuracy of the systems is measured. It's not that it's not possible. NIST did it, and it's a scientific challenge that you need to know how to tackle. But again, it shows that this is science, and today we have a lot of people in the legal system, in effect, practicing science without a license. And that's why this morning I was talking about the need potentially for ethical professional rules for operators of artificial intelligence in the legal system. I will leave it to that. If there are questions, or do you want to add something?
I'll just answer questions.
We've got exactly 15 minutes, so
okay, I'll be 5.
Comments and then we can
okay, then we can do questions. First of all, I just want to say, Nick, when I first saw these charts, which was yesterday or the day before, I mean, they blew me away because we have what I had always thought is sort of one of the most common and useful tools used by judges all the time. And it got me thinking, well, do the users of this technology have the foggiest idea of what they're using? And I don't know. I mean, it's a big question in my mind, and that brings me to. I want to talk to you a little bit about another hat that I wear, which raises the same kind of question. So, for the last 3.5 years, I have been the federal court-appointed monitor of the New York City Police Department in the stop and frisk litigation in New York. And in that role, I've had to learn a lot about the way the police make decisions. That is, what's the process that they use to make decisions. And I'm not going to be talk about that so much as use one example, which is not private. It was announced by the police commissioner himself some time ago, and there were news articles about it. He called it anyway, instant polling. It was an instant poll. There's been a lot of pressure on the police department to take into account community sentiment and so forth. So they announced a program of instant polling. They hired very competent pollers people who had been used in political campaigns using very high-tech data and artificial intelligence. And I began to think about that, and it just raises some questions here, which is, why are they doing that? In other words, what is the point? It seems to me that it will inevitably be used in some way in decision making. Otherwise, why do it? Now, this is all speculation because it hasn't happened yet. It's in its experimental phase. But it seems to me that when the police department is a very hierarchical organization, decisions are made at police headquarters. They're made in precincts by the commanding officer of precincts. There are roughly 66 precincts. And they're made on the street by cops. And every single one of those levels will eventually be a user, assuming it goes forward, will be a user of this information and will be at least a factor in decision making. And I thought it's important to ask the question, why? In other words, is it a good idea that something like the instant polling, in effect, should be used in decision making on important elements and affect people so closely? I would say I've recently done some reading on the history of polling, and this debate about about polling has been going on for a very long time. In the 1920s and 30s, actually in the 20s, when polling was invented, and then into the 30s, many significant thinkers were saying that polling is the most serious threat to our republic. Internally, they were talking about. They weren't talking about, fascism in Europe and so forth, but the most serious threat to our republic that they knew about. And what they were saying is, and notice they used the word republic, they didn't use the word democracy, because this is a debate that has been going on since the founding. Are we a democracy? Are we a republic? Are we some kind of combination? And if you want decision making to be made, do you want decision making to be sort of driven the bottom up, or do you want it driven by representative, either appointed or elected from the top down? And this has been a huge debate in our country, actually from the founding. And so I don't have any answers to this question, but I think before we decide, or anybody decides what's a good use or a bad use, they have to first ask the question, what do we mean by democracy? What do we want this republic to be? How do we want it to be governed? Which we haven't really touched on here. So that's my speculation thought. Now, so anybody have, we have about maybe 10 minutes or so.
Yep.
So let's have some questions or conversation or whatever. It doesn't have to necessarily be about what we said, but it's been a very interesting morning. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, could you speak up?
Thank you. I think it's interesting what you said about trying to define what democracy should be versus what a republic should be, because one thing that I had noticed in questions that had come up earlier this morning is that a couple of times people talking about AI and the invasion of privacy that it represents, for example, Google looking at people on the street and facial identification and so forth, had said, quote unquote, I believe this is quote, this is no longer a democracy, or this will not be a democracy. And I really question whether people use the word democracy in a careless way that can lead to careless dialogue, because democracy is, maybe it's not a greatly defined term, but it's a very specific term that has to do with voting rights, with the right for representation, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with whether or not, I mean, I'm all for privacy, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with whether or not you have facial recognition on the street, whether or not people know where you are at all times, and so forth. And I think that it's important not to engage in that kind of overinflated dialogue where you use heavy-duty words, but rather to focus on what is really being threatened and whether, in fact, our way of government is being threatened or whether it's something else.
Somebody else?
I think it might be worth adding, just from the perspective of our legal system in the US, we believe that if the facts are known, that justice can be served. If everybody understands what really happened, all the facts, and the purpose of discovery, looking through the document population to find everything that's relevant to the case, which is what the studies Nicholas introduced were about, is designed to get those facts out and available, because that's the underlying premise of our justice system. So the issue, one of the issues that comes out from these results is that we're not doing a very good job as lawyers if we're using systems that aren't working and aren't serving that purpose. And to the extent we spend a lot of money, either law firm billing or service provider or tool rentals to get a poor result, we're doubly not serving our justice system or our clients. So I think one of the takeaways, and it applies to what we were talking about earlier and all the other forms of AI out there, is are we actually getting what we intended to get? And just because you have a result doesn't mean you have a good result. And how do we get to the bottom of that problem?
I wonder if perhaps both the chart and the comment may have something to do with the massive shift from people looking for evidence-based facts and now believing in faith-based facts.
Can you just repeat the last part? Because they're static.
Faith-based facts. I believe it, therefore it's so.
So are you saying that that's integrating into the data?
What I'm suggesting is that a good part of the problem is that what people believe is no longer primarily evidence-based facts, but facts that are based upon belief.
I heard somebody speak recently, it was actually a few years ago, who said that most Americans, the majority of Americans believe they get their news from blog posts. And so the question of what do you believe is the fact versus what is actually the fact is interesting and will increasingly permeate the data sets, including those in litigation.
So there is something I want to add to this, though, because I think that is true. I just want to say that with respect to those studies, I think that particular problem does not apply. And the reason for that is that me? I'm sorry. The reason I think it doesn't apply to those studies is because, in effect, what NIST did was they picked one person, one lawyer, whose judgment was deemed to be the truth. So we weren't interpreting or they weren't, right, or brokering between different views of the world. It was one view, and could you really replicate and automate that view? And the answer, again, I think is very troubling in a way.
So to comment on your question, as far as what I was saying, I would say that I think it's a major problem, for example, in this experiment that the police department is doing, or an issue in any event, because they're asking people for their opinions. That's what they're asking about. Their opinions about certain things, their opinions. And I'll just say, going back to this history of polling, that was one of the main issues that these commentators focused on. There, the information was not so much about, people weren't getting the information from the internet. They were getting their information from advocates on radio and like that. But it's the same at a much smaller scale, same problem. I don't know whether I came away sort of optimistic or pessimistic reading about this history, because optimistic in the sense that it tells me that we somehow survived all of that and we got here, but the scale now is way bigger. So
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, so I thought this was a fascinating point about polling, and to relate to the previous question, I think it's less a question of faith-based facts.
I'm sorry, Kathy.
It's a question of faith-based facts and a question of social-based facts. And so I also want to just say that, like, in terms of democracy, getting back to the democracy point, there's a question of representative democracy and direct democracy, but in between that, there's also the question of deliberation. And I think that's the thing that we really can lose. And I was very fascinated recently to read an article about by technologists about how to deal with quite ethical questions that come in autonomous vehicles, like should you run over the kid or the omelette, the old lady, those questions, and suggesting a way to do it that was essentially by polling, and this as being like a democratic way. But I was really questioning whether that is really a democratic way to make an ethical decision. So I think there are things that are better off done by aggregating independent views, and there are things that are not better off done that way, and we kind of have to, to me, it seems like we need to figure out which one we're talking about. So.
Okay, so we have to stop this now. I just would say that some of what I was reading, just to commend it to you, is in Jill Lepore's book. I think it's called These Truths. The book is about the whole history of the United States. But in the section that she talks about polling, I got some of that information from there. And she's got a lot of footnotes there that you can look if you're more interested. It's very interesting.